So hi everyone, I'm Tara Mahoney. You may have remembered me if you came to workshop 2. I'm the research and engagement manager at SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative. And I'll be hosting this workshop on climate communication for researchers. So this is our fourth workshop in our climate action research workshop series, which we've been co-hosting with the Climate Hub at the University of Toronto. And I just wanted to invite Vic. I know you're in the room with the Climate Hub folks at U of T, and I know Laura Tozer, who runs the Climate Lab with you, isn't here today, but I'm just wondering if you wanted to say a few words about the Climate Hub before we start.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I have like a small laptop and then a big screen, so just navigating all of that. Thank you so much, Tara, for being here and for getting everything sorted. I know it's probably stressful, but we're all just chilling and having a good time waiting for your wisdom. My name is Vic, and I am a PhD student here at U of T, but also the hub coordinator for the U of T Climate Hub. This is kind of Laura's project, and there's a lot of amazing people who are involved, but it's about kind of mobilizing climate efforts and allowing young climate researchers and those in the community interested in climate work to kind of have a place to land and navigate that space. And so this workshop series has been super helpful for a number of people, many of whom are in the room with me. Say hi, everyone. So we're really excited to be here and to hopefully, again, translate this knowledge into the projects that we're all working on. So thank you so much for having us.
I just want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples, otherwise known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I said at my last workshop, but I share this photo. This is a photo of Still Creek, which is um, a creek that, close to my house that goes underground and comes up. And there's been a effort over the past 20 years or so to restore the creek and daylight it in certain places, especially since it goes through quite heavy industrial areas of Vancouver. And the folks who started that work had a vision about 15 or 20 years ago that they could restore it to a place where the salmon would return. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be the old growth forest that it was about 250 years ago, but people were making strides to bring the salmon back. And in 2012, and then again, I think in 2017 and 2019, the chum salmon did come back. And slowly but surely, the creek is being restored. And I see this as a symbol of climate action research and just climate engagement in general, of just that slow at times and deliberate work of just repair and restoration, and it, doing it in collaboration with the more than human, to restore life. So I want to, acknowledge the land for all those gifts that they give us, and of course the Indigenous people who have been stewarding that land for thousands of years and who continue to steward it as we face, ongoing challenges of pipelines and things like that that can poison our land and waters. And so, as I mentioned, I'm the Community Engaged Research Manager at the Community Engaged Research Initiative. We're located at 312 Main in the downtown east side of Vancouver. We have a satellite office there. And we support community engaged research across the university. So we have several programs that do that. We have a fellowship program where we support grad students in learning community engaged research. We have our 312 Main Research Shop program, where we then hire grad students to work with community organizations to provide research services. We actually have a job opening right now with Falls Creek Friends and the Georgia Strait Alliance for a really cool community mapping project. So if you're an SFU grad student right now, I encourage you to apply. We also have our fellowship program is currently accepting applications as well. So you can check those out on our website, both available to SFU students. So just a bit about my background and what kind of brings me to climate change work. I worked in public engagement for a long time before I started my PhD in communication. But it was really, I mean, there was several sort of chapters of what led me to care about climate change and climate impacts and solutions. But I would say the biggest one was having my kids. Both of my daughters were born in extremely hot and smoky conditions. My one younger daughter, Phoenix, was born during the heat dome on the hottest day on record. And so, yeah, that was an incredibly scary experience in a lot of ways, and just not being able to bring your newborn out into the fresh air and show them the world right away because it was too smoky, and just feeling that isolation and claustrophobia was extremely hard at a time when you're supposed to be welcoming new life into the world. But from there, it's only intensified my commitment to this work, and knowing that this will be my life's work. This will probably be their life's work. This is generational. This is 10 generations in the future. This is the work of 1,000 years. And so I like to keep that long mindset in mind when I'm working on this stuff, knowing that the urgency can be very overwhelming sometimes, and just knowing that we don't all have to carry that urgency so closely, we can know that we'll do our part, and the future generations will do their part as well. So this is a bit of the work that we've done in our office at CERi. I'm going to go into some of this work a little bit in my presentation, but we don't just work on climate. We work on a bunch of a spectrum of issues, but climate has taken quite a prominent position in our work, just because it's obviously such an important issue, and communities really care about it and are really grappling with the impacts, and want to understand how to act in this moment. And so we follow what the community needs and wants. And so that's why we've focused a lot on climate in the past few years. And so just a bit on the outline. So we're just going to do a few little intros. I have some key concept principles and best practices I'll be talking about, how it relates to climate communication and community engaged research. It'll be kind of like an unconventional approach to communication. If you've done any sort of like communication strategy workshops, or even a climate communication workshop, there'll be a bit of that, but I'm more looking at it from a community engaged research perspective. So it's a little bit different, but I hope it'll bring something maybe a bit fresh to the space. And then I'm also going to reference a bunch of tools and resources. So if you're looking for like maybe a more conventional, like how do I make a communication strategy for my research kind of thing, there's existing workshops on that I will link to, that that you can go and watch. But this is a bit of a different take on it. So just a disclaimer there. And then yeah, we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So I was just curious, as an icebreaker. I'm always like watching climate communication films and workshops and podcasts and literary magazines and stuff, and I'm wondering what's if there's like a really memorable piece of climate art, culture, or communication that you've encountered lately, and what made it effective. Um, and feel free to just, speak into the room if that's easier. I can start because I have a couple that I've experienced lately. The climate change exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery is incredible. I think it's the first like exhibition of that size on this topic in the world. And yeah, it's just really beautiful multimedia. Like there's sculpture, there's painting, there's video, there's sound, there's textiles. It's just really, really amazing. And really changed, I don't know, my relationship and orientation to climate and how I understand it. So for those folks in Vancouver, I highly recommend that. I also watched Project Hail Mary on the weekend, which isn't climate explicitly. It's a movie about space and aliens, and friendly encounters kind of with other life. But I thought it had climate themes around, just like the relationship to the planet that we have, and and what our sort of like responsibilities are to that, and how to be in good relationship with our planet, and also with other life, in this case, like extraterrestrial life. But that theme of like relationship was really strong in that film, and I feel like that's a big theme about of climate work and especially climate communication work that comes up quite often.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in also I loved Project Hail Mary and I did cry. But so sweet. Um One thing that really like struck a chord with me is I got the privilege of teaching an ethics course at OCAD University, which is a design school here, or predominantly like art-based school. And one of my students had taken my class as just an elective and piqued an interest in ethics, and ended up turning their final capstone project into like using ethical frameworks and drawing kind of physical manifestations and painting them of the forest fires in BC. And so I had the privilege of like going to the exhibit, and I actually purchased a piece that now sits on my desk. But seeing kind of that translation of something that you didn't know had an impact on someone become something that they deep dive into through art, was really powerful. So that was my favorite kind of piece of
Mm,
climate communication I saw.
thank you for that. Yeah, that's so cool. I've noticed that as a theme, like where people build on science or they build on other people's insights and they use their skills or their gifts that they have to like articulate it in a different way or think about it in a new way. And I really love that aspect of the interdisciplinarity of climate and just how it's such a rich storytelling topic because it touches on everything and it involves everybody. So there's so much opportunity for collaboration and creativity. Climate action research is like this term, the way that the working definition that I'm working with is what's here. So a combination of climate action and action research. I think of it as a form of community organizing that uses research to achieve outcomes determined by the communities impacted or involved. And in this way, it becomes a catalyst for not only data, but for activating relationships, expanding agency, and connecting lived experience to creative practice and policy influence. Um, and so communication is obviously a big part of how this happens, and it's guided by a theory of change. So that's I already kind of went into that in our first workshop, but just to review, that's the definition that we're working with to think about communication. Oh, yeah, there was one last point there, that it's strengthened by solidarity, which is an important one. So how is climate action research related to communication? We'll move to the next slide. So it's really thinking about, I mean, communication, you could also use the word knowledge mobilization there. You could use the word engagement there. They're all kind of related terms that mean similar things. Um, the way that we think about it in community engaged research is, and also in knowledge mobilization is it's happening all the time. It's not just something that you're done your research and then you figure out how to communicate it. The communication is ongoing, and it looks different at different stages. But the point I'm trying to make is just to be mindful of your communication at every step of the way and how it's like building and it's, in relationship with other stages of research and things like that. And so before you start the research, identifying community priorities, building partnerships, and co-designing the research questions, that's all interpersonal communication. That's like understanding how to approach someone respectfully, how to build trust, how to activate your networks in order to build trust, things like that. How to uh, communicate a code and design a co-design process for figuring out what your research questions are. All of that type of communication happens before a research project starts. Um, And then during the research, if you are working in a community engaged research setting, maybe you're sharing emerging findings as they're coming in, and you're gathering feedback or reflections on things that you're learning as you go. I'm going to share some examples in a little bit about this, but you're facilitating dialogues, you're facilitating workshops. That's a whole communication sort of like skill set. And always kind of like doing it in this way of being self-reflexive about how am I building trust? How am I showing up respectfully? and considerations like that. And then after the research, that's when, we really start to talk about what usually people think of as knowledge mobilization or communication, which is you have these findings, how do you translate them? How do you get them out there and seen and heard and understood? How do you support decision making if that's something that you're looking to influence? How do you inform policy and practice and do that like power mapping work and understanding who the decision makers are and how to speak to them? And then if you're trying to mobilize a community, how do you create communication, assets or strategies that will mobilize like a specific community related to your research? But just to emphasize, I've already sort of made this point, but like the key community engaged research principles related to communication is this idea of like co-creation. So community members help shape the communication. And this is just, it's kind of like common sense in a way. It's like if you are trying to communicate to a specific community, if those community members are helping you, craft your key messages, and inform your storytelling, then that communication is going to resonate with that community much better than if you on your own just develop that, or a research team like disconnected from the community develops it. So that co-creation piece is really important. Accessibility, so the research has to be very understandable and the usefulness has to be clear. Reciprocity, so what is the value that the participants in the communities are getting from the communication? What are they using it for? So that ties into the before research stage that I was talking about, where talking with your community about what would be useful, what would be a useful communications tool that might come out of this project. I've had partners tell me, like when I was doing my PhD, my community partner said, we really need a theory of change document for our organization. And we need that to be backed up by like theory of change research when it comes to, they were a youth engagement organization. So that was like a piece of communication that was really useful and important to them. And so I made sure that I produced that at some point, like in my trajectory of my PhD. And we had another project where the community really wanted this was in a downtown east side project that we're working on climate resilience, where the community wanted a series of posters that was created by them in the aesthetic that they use in that community. And so we worked with folks that were living in supportive housing, and we were like, what types of posters resonate with people that live in this building? And they helped us design it, and we had an honorarium that we could offer them to help us do that design work. So this, and then, this is obviously related to relationship building. So the communication process is just part of the larger process of building relationships and building trust. And then the action orientation. So again, how does this support? It doesn't, it's decision making and collective action, but what is like the change? What is the thing that the community is working towards, and how does your communication support that? Maybe it's just a small piece, but just having that in mind as you're thinking about how you're going to communicate. And we'll move to the next slide. So this is just a kind of like a rough sketch of how these two things might compare. So traditional research communication, we all know it. You publish a journal article, maybe 10 people read it. Um, well, no, I mean, not always, but like a very well-read journal article, I think, is like 200 people. And so it's good. That's a targeted audience that you're reaching that, maybe it'll be very relevant to, but it's also very limited. And often those journal articles are behind paywalls. And so it's like, how is that, how is that equitable? Is that access? Maybe you present at a conference, but again, very limited in terms of who can show up to a conference. Maybe you'll write an op-ed or a blog, and maybe you'll post on social media. There might be others there that I've missed, but that is what kind of comes to mind in terms of like conventional communication. And then on the other side, you can see climate action research communication, which is you're creating toolkits, guides for specific groups. You're hosting social gatherings to share findings and gather for further feedback. You're hosting potentially workshops. Maybe you're presenting your findings to decision makers with the community. Maybe you're developing art, illustrations, infographics, and social media content that goes out over time. Maybe you're sharing the stories from the participants directly, like oral history type thing, or and maybe there's video series or something like that. Or maybe you're using your research to contribute to local planning consultations. So as you can see, very quite a bit more specific, quite a bit more applied, and more, collaborative with the people who are involved in your research. So we'll move to the next slide. I'm just going to go over a few principles of climate communication. I teach a climate communication and continuing studies at SFU, and it's a really, it's a 6-week course, so I'm just gonna like barely scratch the surface of what's there, but there are some principles that come up again and again in climate communication that I think are relevant to this conversation I want to mention. So we'll just move to the next slide. Um, the If you didn't know about Reclimate already, I just wanted to share them as a incredible resource in Canada. They're based out of Carleton University, and they specialize in climate communication and engagement. And if you're looking for anything like how to frame a message, like, the Getting to Yes, which came out recently, is about how to frame messages around renewable energy to a community so that they might be more receptive to those, and how to think about who the different audiences might be for that, what their concerns will be. They do incredible polling. They do media monitoring. So they look at the media narratives in Canada around climate and what's being said and why, and analysis around that. They focus on interpersonal communication. So just to say, there's a lot there. They have all their webinars online. Um, this is an incredible resource to tap into. We'll move to the next slide. So yeah, just some key insights here. So climate communication is cultural. So people interpret it through their values, their identity, and their worldviews, not just facts. That's a mistake that the climate movement has made for a long time, which is the information deficit model, it's called, where people assume like people just need more information. If they only understood the research around air quality, for example, and how, uh, car infrastructure and burning fossil fuels is really, really bad for our health and the air quality. If they only knew the numbers, they would change. And that's not true. Like it's not counterproductive to have that research, of course, but people are looking at that at facts like that through their values, their identity, their worldviews, their position in their work, how they were raised. And so you have to take all of that into consideration. You can't just push research on people and expect that it's going to resonate with them. You have to frame it and couch it in the values that they hold. And that's about understanding your audience and respecting where they're coming from, which is, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Emotions matter. So in my first workshop, I did the whole session on emotion. So I won't go into it a lot here, but just to know that like climate is a very emotionally dynamic, I guess you could say, topic. There's a lot of fear, anger, hope. There's a lot of suppression. People avoid it. They don't want to talk about it. And so that's something to contend with as you're thinking about your messaging. Trust is key. As the media environment continues to change into AI and like deep fakes and these echo chambers of communication and influence culture, it's really important that trusted messengers are delivering climate communication. So what that means, there's the kind of classic trusted messengers. I think doctors are the top, like the most trusted messenger in society. I think it's doctors. Politicians are kind of further, like they're not that high on the list. Um, but the trusted messengers are basically like people from the community. So your friends, your family, people uh, who have earned the trust of society. That's waning. The people who used to be trusted aren't trusted as much anymore. So it's dynamic, but just to understand that that trust factor is really important. Um, Polarization and disinformation are growing threats. So this is like a huge subtopic within climate communication because the disinformation is at like an industrial scale at this point. A lot of it fueled by the fossil fuel industry around, it's disinformation meets like conspiracy culture. I don't know if you're familiar with like the 15-minute cities like fiasco, but basically the idea of 15-minute cities, which is just like the idea that you build cities so that everything is within a 15-minute walk, very uncontroversial urban planning, like best practice that's been around for a long time, um, was is starting to get implemented in cities as climate becomes more of a concern. And it got caught up in these conspiracy networks, and um, people are showing up at, this happened a lot in Oxford, UK, but it was also happening in Ontario. People are showing up at city council meetings for 15-minute cities and thinking that it's going to be climate lockdowns and you're going to have ID to get from one part of the city to another. And, and it's like the Davos crowd is behind it, and like, and it's connected to Bill Gates. And there's just like all of these conspiracy theories that are connected to this idea of 15-minute cities. And that actually makes it spread more because it is so like it is triggering like the lizard brain in a lot of ways. And so just to know that that is a growing threat, which is why what we're talking about is so important, why there needs to be communication at like a very local level that can be trusted so that we can inoculate ourselves against some of these like nefarious forces that are at play. Um, Story, I mean, I'll talk a bit about story too. Story is super important. So I shared the story at the outset of my kids and how that informs my climate work. And I try and start every talk with like my little climate story, just because I think it opens people allows people to know me in a way that's more than just, the person giving the workshop. And it also, I think it can humanize people. Usually, if you tell a personal story, you're showing a little bit of vulnerability, and that I think makes people feel safe. And so, stories, understanding your climate story and how you show up in a space and tell that story, I think is a really important skill that we can develop. Yeah, I'll talk a bit about that more in a minute. And then creativity. So we'll get more into this, but obviously, creativity is a huge asset for us in this work. So we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so I have 4 tips I wanted to share that I think are useful for climate action research when it comes to communication. So we'll just move to the next slide. So the first one is good communication requires having a theory of change. So moving away from how do I communicate my findings to what change am I trying to support? How can my research contribute to that change? Who needs to be involved in that change? And what role can my research play in bringing them together? Um, you might not have this all figured out at the beginning, and that's okay. And you might not even, your theory of change, it won't be perfect. It might not happen. It's not about being right. It's just about thinking it through, like from a strategic perspective. So I encounter a lot of researchers, especially earlier in their career, but even later in their career, where I read their research and it can be brilliant in a lot of ways, but I'm like, but like, what's the plan? Like where does this fall on the trajectory of getting this into the hands of the people who this is going to make a difference to? And often they haven't thought about that. They don't consider that their role. And I think that's wrong. Like, it's not something that singular researcher has to do on their own by any means, but it's like finding who the other people are in the space that are doing that and building relationships with them. So just thinking it through, like, I'm gonna do this research report, and then I'm gonna reach out to, or maybe it's before that, it's like I'm gonna reach out to this person who has a similar interest to me, or maybe it's an NGO working on it. Then I'm going to talk to them about what they might need, and then I'm going to produce that for them, and then that will lead to this change that they're looking for, and then that will lead to this, and just like what is the theory of change? So I think that's just like really important to keep in mind, and it's going to change, it's going to evolve as the work evolves, but just starting there, I think is a good place to orientate yourself. I'll move to the next slide. Yeah, this was just to give an example of the project we did at CERi. So we worked with the Climate Emergency Unit to review the CBC's climate reporting. And so our theory of change with this project was, if we monitor the CBC climate reporting for 2 weeks, um, and we find discrepancies in their, not discrepancies, but almost like a failure, because we knew anecdotally they weren't doing good climate reporting, but we wanted to prove that to the journalists and the producers and the people, the ombudsman person, the people who make the decisions. And so we were like, we have to have evidence. So then we did this project over 2 weeks where we engaged volunteers to watch the CBC, and they filled out a survey every time there was a climate story or a lack thereof. And to make a long story short, we found, our hypothesis, I guess, was right. The climate reporting was very poor. They weren't even saying the words climate change. They weren't even connecting extreme weather to climate. They were almost never talking about the cause of climate change. They weren't saying the words fossil fuel, almost never. And only 9%, I think we have there. So anyways, our theory of change was, if we build up this evidence base, then we can take that to journalists and producers who we know care about climate change, because we didn't assume that they didn't care. We knew that they did, but they didn't have, like, they needed some support. So we made this to support them, so that they could bring this report to their, editorial meetings or whatever, and say, like, we're falling short. Like, we're the public broadcaster. We're publicly funded. Like, we need to do better. And that's exactly what happened. So we also worked, we built it into our knowledge mobilization plan to schedule meetings with some producers and some of the executive. We didn't get to meet with the executive, but we did talk to their, like, underlings or their assistant or whatever, who said they passed along our report, but we just kept sending it to different people that we knew. Um, and so that was the theory of change. And it worked to some extent. I mean, it's not perfect. It didn't change the CBC overnight, but I think it did have an impact on some of the journalists and producers that both we're falling short, and also that we're doing good work in the space, because our research also found that there was some shows that were actually doing really good climate reporting, and we highlighted that as well. And so it was good for them to, like, the early edition, for example, in Vancouver actually has quite, it's waning a bit, but at the time they were doing quite strong climate reporting. And so we highlighted that and, sent the report to those folks as well. So yeah, just to say that the theory of changes can be really instructive to how you structure your research and your communication. So we'll just move along. Yeah, we can just skip this slide. Um, so number two, good communication requires understanding your audience. So we talked a bit about this already, but it's just the idea of moving from what do people need to know to who are the people I'm trying to engage, what matters to them, and what do they need from my research and or knowledge mobilization. So getting specific. It's not like the general public. It's like, who are the impacted people? Why will they care? How do I communicate this to them in a way that they'll hear it, thinking about it in that way. We'll move to the next slide. So this is just an example I use, like a chart I use in my course, to just illustrate the point of thinking about different audiences and how and what they care about. This is like a guess. There could be other things, of course. And then tailoring your message to that audience. So if you're a parent, you're thinking about your child's health, family well-being, future generations. So then your climate message is reflecting that. And so when you read it as a parent, you feel like it's speaking to you. So you're much more likely to engage in that focus group or that interview or fill out that survey if you're thinking, oh, this is important for my kids. And you're thinking that because the message reminded you of that, like you may have not have gone there automatically if the message was just like, extreme heat is dangerous for populations that live in cities, or whatever a general statement might be. You might not have thought of your parental identity and your kids in that statement, but now that it's communicated to you in this way, you are thinking about that, and you're much more likely to engage because you see a stake in it, right? And it's the same for all these other audiences that we've put here. Business leaders, that thinking about how do you articulate um, climate impacts in a way that affects your bottom line, affects your workers, it affects your workers' health, your workers' compensation. The big sort of campaign in Vancouver right now is like maximum temperatures in buildings, and how that legislation is wanting to be passed. And maybe if you're a business leader, you're thinking, well, are you going to be liable if someone passes out and hurts themselves because it was too hot in the kitchen that they were working in? Um, that's a climate, that's like a climate ally. That business owner is potential climate ally because they don't want to get sued because it was too hot during a heat dome and their workers weren't, in safe conditions. So there's all kinds of ways to think about how to structure the messaging of what you're working on and your research in relation to the audience that you're talking to. Okay, we'll move on. I made this point already, but just to re-emphasize it here. So knowing your audience is more than just demographics. Like people just think, oh, am I talking to women? Am I talking to, new Canadians? Am I talking to Indigenous folks? Like those demographics are important, of course, but you also have to think about their values, like their lived experience. Are they rural people? Are they living in a city? What roles are they playing? Are they a mother? Are they, an elder? Are they, and then the emotions, like what is the emotional impact of what they might be going through, especially as it relates to climate. So this makes me think of, young people, as we know, are struggling a lot with like hopelessness or anger or despair, or not feeling like the future is going to be safe for them. So if you know that, then that might influence how maybe you take a hope-based communication approach, or maybe you acknowledge that in your communication somehow. And this all, like, again, just to reemphasize the relationships thing, in order to know these things, you have to build relationships. So there's some stuff you can know without a relationship, you can find out through research and that kind of thing. But the really good stuff, you're not going to know unless you find out directly from people what they care about. Okay, we'll move on. So number three, use appropriate tools and compelling assets. I really love this one. I have a bunch of examples to share. Um, so this is really about what are the things you're going to produce to communicate your research. I use the word appropriate there because I think some people, including me, get really excited by the tools and assets, and they're like, let's do like a podcast and let's do like an illustration series, but I think it's important to think through like what is the appropriate thing for the audience. Like maybe a podcast is a perfect thing for them because they're the type of community who will listen to that, who's into that form of communication. Maybe not. Maybe the people you're trying to reach, in the case of our work in the downtown east side, face-to-face communication is like number one. Like you have to, we learned from our community partners that if you want to get key information out in the community, there's like 10 people that you tell, and those people are just around and they tell other people just because that's the role they're playing in the community. Um, and so that in that case, that's what's appropriate for that community. You would not want to make like an app for that community, for example, like an app that you have to sign up for and like all of that. we just actually like um, had an idea of this recently where it was like, that's not going to work. Nobody's going to use that. It's not appropriate for that community. So that just a caveat there of tools and assets. Um, okay, so we'll that the image there was a public policy collage zine that I made as part of my PhD and then turned it into this paper. We have paper copies in our office, and it's just talking about collage as a both a research tool and a form of like participatory communication. So people would we did this during an election, and we at the back of the zine there's like icons, and that you could cut those out and then you could make a collage around what you were voting for. So they were all related to like public policy themes. And this allowed for us to, as a research method, to hear from people about what they were voting for and why. But then it also served as like a communications tool afterwards, these like beautiful collages that we could use to communicate other things going forward. So that's just an example of kind of like a out of the box kind of way of thinking about how method and communication can overlap and inform each other. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. So I've talked about relationships quite a bit and interpersonal communication. So I wanted to share this resource that we have that we've developed out of our office, which is Facilitation for Community Transformation. So this is really about in-person. It could be online as well, but it's about facilitation of communities. And obviously, communication is a big part of facilitation and understanding how to listen well, how to speak well, how to reflect back what people are saying, how to hold a space, how to plan an event. So all of that is in this toolkit. Um, and so yeah, that would be for if you wanting to do these like in person like focus groups or workshops and are wanting to host in a good way and wanting to make sure that your communication is done in a good way as well. So we'll move on to the next slide. Climate visuals. So this is a really awesome tool that was developed by Climate Outreach in the UK. So these are Creative Commons images that you can use for climate communication. So you can see there picturing life with a heat pump, black carbon, energy, and the cost of living in Europe. So these are the thing with climate images in like popular discourse right now, especially in the news. Like if you see like um, when people talk about extreme heat or heat waves, there's often like a photo of like someone at the beach or someone like splashing in a splash park, and it looks fun, right? It's like, oh, it's a hot day in the summer. This is great. Like even subconsciously, that's basically communicating what we don't want to communicate. We want to communicate that it's actually dangerous outside because it can be really so you want an image of like people sweating or in distress or to trigger people's minds like this is not a joke, like this is not having fun in the sun, this is like you need to get to a cool place when it gets over a certain temperature or whatever. So the images are really important, and same with like a positive frame as well, like with the heat pumps, like just showing images of like this is what climate action looks like. It actually looks like installing a heat pump in your co-op or in your apartment or whatever. So like more interesting and accurate climate visuals are really important. So climate visuals is a really good resource if you're looking for that kind of stuff. And a lot of their images are free. Um, we'll move to the next slide. This is another one of my favorite projects. We use these a lot in our reports that we do at CERi. This is a bank of beautiful free illustrations from artists around the world. And so they have a climate series. They also have a series on like belonging and human rights, and they have all these different, and the illustrations are incredible, and there's a lot of them. Completely open access, as long as you credit the artist. Highly recommend using these in if you're doing any kind of community event. Canva is great. We use Canva all the time. This is actually is really complementary to Canva because sometimes the illustrations in Canva are like a little bit like they're not climate specific. And if they are, they're like really kind of like cliche. But these illustrations are more interesting and, done by artists. So they're really well done. Um, so we'll move along. I recently learned about this project from one of our grad students, ArcGIS Story Maps. This is a tool that's offered through post-secondary. So if you're not at a university, you have to pay quite a bit for it annually. Um, but what it allows you to do is to build interactive websites using GIS and build in story into those. So like if you say you're looking at, just to stay with a heat example, you're looking at like heat impacts in the downtown east side. You could have a map of the downtown east side. You could pin on that map like the hottest place, the hottest temperatures, right? Where there's no trees, no breeze, not close to water. And you could say like this is how much hotter it is than this area, which is maybe down by the water in a park. Then you could also, and it's like super easy to use. It's drag and drop. You don't have to have any coding experience. Um, and you can then drop in like recorded stories of like first person reflections. So if you're doing interviews, you could then drop your interviews like where that map pin is, and that then pops up, someone's experience or reflection on maybe that street corner or something when it was really hot. This I'm just like riffing, but point being, incredible tool um, to put all your research, especially if you're working with any kind of scientific data, into a visual format that is more user friendly to an audience who might not be versed in research. So highly, highly recommend this one. We can move along. Um, Podcasting. It's yeah, pretty commonplace now, and I feel like scholarly podcasting happens a lot. So I just want to mention that as that's a thing you can do. Lots of people are doing it. These are some climate research related or climate action related podcasts I like to listen to. Um, Two of them are about communicating climate change. So Climate Shifted and Communicating Climate Change. Those are both excellent podcasts on climate communication if you're interested in diving deeper into it. Eco Justice and Climate Action is a mini series from the Climate Action Research podcast that talks about those themes. Future Ecologies is a local uh, group of people who look at kind of the more than human and futuring around what it might look like to be in better relationship with the more than human. And then Indigenous Climate Action podcast is about climate action that's being led by Indigenous people. And there's the Cited podcast, which is a scholarly podcast, which is quite well done. Their season 4 was all on climate related stuff. And that's more of like a humanities kind of like social science, like long history of the climate sort of movement in different parts of the world, and where some of the core ideas of environmentalism as we know it in the Western world like came from. It's quite interesting. So yeah, just to say podcast is a thing, and you can definitely explore that as a way to communicate your research. And we'll move along. I wanted to point to this. I mentioned this earlier. So when I was saying, if you're looking for resources for how to develop a communication strategy related to your research, like there's a specific thing that you want to do and you want to come up with a plan. The Homelessness Learning Hub, it's not climate related, but they have this 3-part series that's excellent on knowledge mobilization and design, developing a communication strategy, and amplifying your research through social media. It can be applied to any topic. and they have worksheets and stuff, and they've just done a really good job at this type of thing. So highly recommend checking those out if this is what you're needing to do. Okay, and we can move along. I'm gonna, yeah, I'm almost done. I mean, after I'm done this one, I'm gonna open it up for questions, and then I just have a little bit more after that. Um, so number four, good climate communication requires creating opportunities for connection and collective action. So I have been alluding to this the entire time, but um, thinking about climate communication in this way that I'm advocating for helps like and as does community engaged research more generally, helps to bring communities together, basically, like helps us to do the work of climate action better. So it helps us to recognize our shared concerns, identify common interests, build relationships and networks, as I've talked about, create a shared vision of where it is that we're going as a community. So whether that's like researchers and the community they're working with, it helps us to coordinate our responses and mobilize research and support. So I'm just going to give a quick example of what this looks like. I'll move to the next slide. So I've been talking about this project, the Climate Resiliency Roadmap for Nonprofits. This is the work we've been doing in the downtown east side. So with this work, we were, it was co-created with community. And so it was doing all of that stuff I mentioned at the beginning, where you're building those relationships, you're figuring out what's important to them, what their needs are. So that was like the co-creation piece. Um, there was a storytelling element that was really important. So on the left there, that's a testimonial from an outreach and harm reduction worker in the downtown east side about their experience during the heat dome. So these stories are super powerful in communicating the experience people are having on the ground, and how, harrowing that can be, and also how important it is to then it supports the importance of the project to lead with these and to bring these voices in as you're doing the work. Um, and then, to on the right-hand side, the key priorities. So this was the kind of the product of our work together. And this is basically the plan of like, or this is the roadmap of bringing residents, organizations, and the larger community network together to work on this roadmap. And creating this report allows us then to so we had a group of four community partners, but now that we have this report, which is, a communications tool, now we're recruiting more partners. So now we have six partners, and we're talking to funders, and we have, we're building out the network, but we're doing it with these communications tools that are compelling. They're easy to read. They're, straightforward about what, the report goes into, I think it's like 11 or so strategies. They're broken down on a timeline. So this allows us to like approach people. It gives us something to talk about and something to say. There's also a technical report that we had with this, which was for a different audience, right? Which was for a policy audience or a research audience. So if you're a research, and in that technical report, we went through all of the existing, our grad student compiled all of the existing policy research that's on the books at the City of Vancouver as it relates to climate resilience, and did an analysis of that. So if that's what you're into, that is also there for you. And then we also have an at a glance, which is just a 3-page summary of the strategies. So if you just want to give it to someone quickly, and here's the strategies we're talking about, that could be for, maybe a decision maker, maybe someone within a ministry that just wants a quick look at what is it that you're asking for. We have that as well. So we thought through the different audiences and made assets accordingly. Obviously you can't that there are time and money constraints, so you can't make a special thing for every audience that might consume your research, but maybe prioritizing what are the top 2 or top 3 audiences we're trying to reach, and prioritize making assets that will be relevant and easy for them to consume and digest. Um, okay, we'll move along. Okay, so that was a lot. I'm wondering if folks have any reflections or questions as we kind of move more into the discussion portion. Don't be
Hi, thanks
shy.
for your hand up, Tara. I've got, yeah, I think what you said around audience and looking at, often we look at like as communications folks, we look at like the psychographics and the demographics of people. But I think I really enjoyed your point about like the lived experience piece and the roles that they play in their community. Like, if they are the trusted super soccer mom who really
Mhm.
knows, climate change and the soccer season, like, if you're doing a campaign around, climate change to that kind of target audience, then it would be really great to get that super soccer mom to be one of your trusted messengers. And same with I think lived experience. Like one of the things that I've noticed working in communications for a long time is often you're like unlikely folks, you're, person who's worked in logging and fishing, and now they're kind of more environmental as they get older. Those folks have this lived experience out on the land, out on the water, and they can kind of like advise you and speak to you in a way that helps you kind of get a little window into what their folks at the coffee shop are into. And so I think that piece about not only having those folks as like spokespeople, but also kind of like tapping into their really like long lived wisdom is super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciated that. That was like a good reminder about like lived experiences is so great. And it also helps kind of balance when you're doing this real technical, well researched, charts and graphs and pie thing charts and like, but also having a person who's lived and done, you know, real everyday work in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's kind of like engaging your trusted messengers um is like climate engagement in itself, like because people like my experience is that people want to share, like they want to be helpful, like that, that soccer mom who, maybe she doesn't identify as a climate activist or had ever thought of herself that way. But maybe if you, and same with the elder, the elder fisherman or something like that. But if you approach them in a way that's like respectful and and you're really listening to their experience and treating them like they have the influence that they do and that they could be, a leader in this space or an advisor or whatever, that is climate engagement. Like that's kind of what when I think of community engaged research as community organizing, I kind of think of it in that way because your research is compelling you to go and talk to these people. Well, in this case, your communication strategy to go and talk to these folks that can be the voices for the movement, the unlikely folks that don't think of themselves that way, but could be playing that role because, and assuming that they care, right? Because I think everybody cares about this issue in their own way. They might not use the same language, but of course everybody wants clean air and clean water and wants a safe future for their kids. Like, I don't think there's a human on earth that doesn't want that. So just about finding the way to get it and in with people so that you can like welcome them into the movement. Vic, I see your hand up.
There you go.
Okay, so I have a question in terms of the climate action research communication methodologies. Are there any that are more preferred or more efficient in terms of just bringing out views of the community and having them more integrated? Because I know we talked about like toolkits, social gatherings, arts and illustration, stories of participants. In your view, are there any that stand out?
Um, I think it depends. I mean, I'm gonna maybe give like an annoying answer, which it depends, but um I it depends what you're looking to get. Like in terms of efficiency, like in like an efficient way to get quick information would be like a survey, a digital survey. If you're just trying to understand something, and you know a group of people and you think that they will respond to a survey, that can be an efficient way. But then it's like, will they fill it out? Like that's kind of where the community building piece is important because it's like you can have a survey and want to get it done quickly, but who why would people be compelled to fill it out? So if you have a community partner who is aligned with what you're trying to either find out or work on, they might send out that survey link. And then you might get more that in that case, then it becomes more efficient, right? The relationship makes it more efficient because you don't have to go out and try and get all of those responses yourself. You now have this organization that's helping you because they see the value in what you're doing for what they're doing. You know what I mean? So I would say there are, there of the methods I've shared, some of them, of course, take much longer than others, right? And you think about that as you're designing something. But also, I would think about the relationships as an efficiency a piece that can help with that. Sometimes it takes a bit of longer time at the front end, but it actually pays off in the longer term because you just have more energy behind what you're doing, I would say.
Thank you.
Victor also wanted to say. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tara, for mentioning Artists for Climate. What an amazing resource. And those artworks are absolutely stunning. I just took a look and I was like blown away by the global movement of compelling art. So thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah, you're welcome. I absolutely love that project. I think it's such a cool service that they're doing to the movement.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, maybe you can come closer. Is it okay if I have 3 questions?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the first question is basically about bias in storytelling. So I understand that we want to tell like impactful stories and we want the message to be communicated to our audience and target audience, right? But I mean, like we're all human beings. And then my question is there a way that we can avoid bias in the stories that we tell to the audience? Because obviously it's gonna reflect our all like point of view and perspective. And sometimes it's like our sympathy with, the person who encountered the climate disasters or, catastrophe. So that's the first question.
Do you want to get
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to like address this like one by one, or should I raise like all of the questions?
You could do all of them maybe, and then we can work through them.
Great, thank you. And then the second one, I think this one is more about the audience aspect. So on the one hand, that we try to tell like a lot of stories about climate change in order to raise awareness and, like seek for attention to some concrete actions. But then on the one hand, it can create, like climate anxiety between the audience. But then on the other hand, when we see a lot of stories about environment and then climate change, we say, okay, but there is actually nothing concrete happened. And then it can bring people to, like a point of being ignorant, saying that, yeah, it's like we talk a lot about it, but nothing's really happened. So, my question is, how can we fight, the balance between, climate anxiety and being over optimistic about what is really happening on our planet? And that leads me to the third question. I think it's more like general, but I'm curious to know, like from your experience, what can be some challenges in, climate communication to public audience, and also to policy makers. Thank you so much.
With the last one, challenges in could you specify that a bit more?
Yeah, so what are some challenges, like from your experience, what are some challenges in communicating climate stories to the public audience and to policymakers?
Um,
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer these, but I also welcome there's like wisdom in the room as well. So other folks like feel free to jump in as well. So for the first one, bias in storytelling. Yeah, I think this is like a really important question and consideration. Um, I don't know. I kind of I have a mixed thoughts on it. Like I think um of course there's going to be bias, right? Like you can only tell something kind of like from your own perspective, and so there's going to be things that you miss or perspectives you can't fully understand because they're not your lived experience and all of that. Um, and so there's bias that's going to be inherently baked in. Um, and so that I think it's like just accepting that. But then I think there are things that you can do to check that bias, right? To be, and I think those things are like being reflective of it, asking for feedback. I think this is again where the community, your community partners or your collaborators become really important, because asking other folks like, can you take a look at this and let me know, like, is my bias coming through on this? And what do you see from your perspective? Ideally, that person, has like a different, well, of course, they'll have a different lived experience than you. And so I think there are ways of addressing bias so that it's not like overpowering some form of communication. Um, on the other hand, like some communication that's can be very strong because it actually has a strong bias. So it's like kind of like a paradox, because like sometimes you're specifically telling your own story. So it's like I'm telling my own story as like, say it's the example I use in my own life, like as a mother who's experiencing extreme climate events with a newborn baby. Like, of course I'm going to have bias, and that's my own story. And I think the reason why it connects with people is because it is specific and it's like mine. And so and so that is like also can be very like powerful. So it's kind of like a two-edged thing. It's like on one hand you want to, in some cases it's really good to be quite specific, and it's like that adage of like the particular story tells the universal story, so um but then on the other hand, like you don't want your work to be so biased that like people have that reaction of like, oh, of course you're going to say that, because or like just they feel like they already know what you're going to say because your bias is so clear. Like you don't want that to be happening either, which is kind of where you want to check your work with other folks. But I don't know if other people in the room have thoughts on.
Yes, I do.
Hmm.
I would say, much to the sentiment of your presentation. Can you hear me also?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Much to your sentiment with the presentation about really knowing your audience, I think that comes into that becomes a factor when we're talking about bias. Like, for example, I have some, unfortunately, I have some conservative, maybe racist family. And so when I'm talking to them about climate justice, I'm going to be very like if they're even willing to have the conversation with me, I'm going to be very trying to find common ground with people that I normally couldn't, right? I'm going to affirm what they say, but then also try to like hit them with, well, but this is happening to people in the global south or something like that, right? Whereas when I'm presenting to an audience that's maybe has a mixed view or has already been introduced to some climate news, I'm going to be more about my opinion, especially if I say I'm from like the University of Toronto, right? That already gives me the ethos, that gives me credit already. So yeah, I would just say I think it really depends on the audience.
I also in the room, I think a lot of like cognitive dissonance and shame, the role that shame plays and the choices that people make, and like really not wanting to feel like a bad person for whatever choice that is, and like how that actually comes into play when you're trying to communicate with someone. I used to work in my previous life in cycling advocacy, and I remember so many times people would just come up to me and say, I drive a car, like don't judge me. And I was like, it's okay. Like and then you had to think about the conversation where you're talking about like, I don't want you to not drive a car. I just want to be able to get to work safely the way that I get to work. Or like I want everybody to have that opportunity regardless. Or
maybe you do bike on the weekends and you also want your kids to be able to do that. But like thinking about like how to not ever introduce the concept of shame so that a person could like connect with you and not just like write it off as like I don't, that's not for
Yeah.
me.
You're a weird lefty. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Sorry to jump in, but I completely.
I would love to.
Like, yes, yes.
But I try
And
not to
ours
be when
was-
I'm speaking to my conservative family.
Exactly, exactly.
I will just, Steve, I see your hand up. I just wanted to offer some feedback on that because I think it's a really important point. And I was debating on whether or not to include this in the presentation, and I didn't, but I'm going to reference it here, which is Renee Lertzman's work. She's a psychotherapist who focuses on climate and climate engagement. And she talks about this exact thing around feelings around shame and how the inner conflict people have, even people who are supportive of the movement, have around climate action. So like you know, you don't want to contribute to the problem, but you really want to go on that holiday to Europe, you know, or you don't want to contribute to the problem, but you're having a kid, you know, or like whatever the thing is, everybody's got these conflicts, internal conflicts that they have. And her suggestion is like in our communication, we should be voicing those up front, so that we can all, so that we don't have that shame, that like that feeling of one person shaming another, especially if we don't intend to do that. So she says, like, by voicing that inner conflict within ourselves, like, then other people can feel safe to know that like it's okay, but that like, you know, we were born into a fossil fuel economy. Like, you can't survive without consuming fossil fuels. And so, like, I don't know if you would want to lead with that, but just as that as an understanding. And she has a whole bunch of like really incredible tools to think through how to do that well, at an interpersonal level and also at a broader communications level. And the other thing I've seen I found quite compelling is like, I'm from Alberta originally, and a lot of folks there work in the fossil fuel industry, and it's so very deeply embedded in the culture, and people don't want to hear about climate, even if they care about it. They're very conflicted because that's their livelihood and all that stuff. Um, and one thing that I've started to do, and I've seen work well, is like leading with, in that context, so knowing your audience, leading with like, fossil fuels are amazing. They're amazing. They're magic, like, because they are. They've, look at the society they've built. Like, you can look at Amazon, you can, you know, get something magically appears in front of your door when you press a button on your phone. That's incredible. Like, it's, you know, lifted millions of people out of poverty. Like, so starting there, like, because that is true, right? It's also done a lot of awful things. But like, I think because I know that the people that work in that industry, like, they think that they're working for a core energy source for the society. And they see themselves as like, I'm getting that resource to market. And that is helping people get their groceries. That's helping people get to school. That's helping, you know, and so understanding that that's how they see it, and then leading with that in your communication. And that doesn't mean that you're pretending to be something you're not. You're saying something that's true. But you're also saying, you know, but then you follow, what I've done is like, and then follow that up with, but we can't do that anymore, right? Because we know that it's poisoning the air and the water, and it's creating a dangerous future for our kids. And so, that is like, there's like little like strategies like that can lead with empathy and come from a different side of truth, you know, or different, and like address your bias in that way, because it's not comfortable for me to say all of that, but I think that it might help if I'm talking to that audience to maybe disarm them and make them feel that like I do understand where they're coming from, and starting with that. So again, just how important it is to sort of know your audience in that way. Steve or Stephen, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great conversation, and this discussion really got me thinking. And I was wondering, Tara, your take on as we're talking about biases, storytelling, the knowing your audience, shaming, where may the overlap of using lessons from the corporate capital world of marketing to sell this idea of being more climate conscientious? I think it's clear that those of us on the call are here because we are already in that camp. But how do we, as the example brought up of bringing that family in, that's right wing, racist, conservative, how do we use marketing to be like, hey, actually, could be fun, or this could be sexy, if you will. Like what lessons can we learn from our cohorts that are doing that business marketing portion, so that we come out on the other end in a net positive example, or a net positive solution, that can bring people on board without shaming, but we get them feeling like it's like we use some, psychoanalysis or whatever to figure out that part to market towards them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such a good question. I think, yeah, I mean, marketing works, right? We know marketing works. And it works at a subconscious level, it works at a conscious level. So I think we should absolutely be using those techniques. Yeah, and bigger climate campaigns, I think, do that. I think the trick is like, how do you do that in a way that's accessible financially to the movement? Like we're up against the fossil fuel industry that has endless money. They can spend millions on the best creative minds in the world working on their stuff, right? So it's like, how do we come at that in a way that utilizes our gifts that of storytelling, and I think there is a movement. So there's an organization called Creatives for Climate, and they're all ad agency workers. And some of them are people who they've either left an ad agency and are now working on climate, or they've transitioned their agency to be a climate focus. And part of what they do is they don't work with any fossil fuel companies. And then they also do like these ad-based campaigns, and think about how to tell compelling stories in this way, borrowing from that industry with the people working in that industry. So I think that's a really good place to start, because they're forming a network of allies in that creative industry that I think is super powerful. The other reference I would make is, I think it's called the Good Work Playbook, I want to say. It came out a few years ago, and it's designed for storytellers who want to work on climate. And the woman who organized it, she used to be a climate organizer in the States, and she's organizing like Hollywood types, basically, to think about how to incorporate climate messaging into storylines. And even little things like having a heat pump as part of a story, or having, the main character bike to work instead of drive to work. And so there's all different elements of that, sort of like storytelling techniques, that movement is also happening in Hollywood and beyond. So I absolutely agree. I think it's super key, and there's groups of people who are working on it. And that Good Work Playbook, they're getting meetings with studios. They're making the case, and they actually did. There's a research tie in here, because they started that organization with research that showed, like, it was similar to the CBC research I had mentioned, where it was like 3% or something of like the films that were made in the United States the year they did the research, which was maybe 4 years ago, like had a climate theme or mentioned climate at all. Like, it was super, super low, especially considering it's a phenomenon everybody is experiencing. And so they went with this research, like that's what kind of led to the creation of this playbook that they made, and then these meetings that they were able to get. And they're basically making the case, like, your writing, your films are going to be irrelevant if you're not talking about this issue because so many people are experiencing it. And so you're just going to pretend there's not forest fires every year. Like you're just going to pretend that like people's insurance isn't going like crazy because of climate impacts. Like, so you have to write that into the story if you want to write stories that people feel they can connect to. So, yeah, so that work is happening, which is exciting. I just wanted to return to the two other questions that were asked. One was around audiences and climate anxiety and the idea of like, you know, nothing, it feels like nothing is happening, and how do you find a balance between anxiety and like optimism or hope? And yeah, this is like a really hard one because it can feel like nothing is happening, but I think it's like there is always stuff happening. So I think it's a misunderstanding that there isn't, especially if you're looking at the local level. You can always find stories of someone doing something. Maybe nothing's happening at the decision-making level, which is unfortunately like the moment that we're in. But even there's stuff happening behind the scenes, you know, that is worth talking about. Really like opaque policies that are being made that are supportive of climate, you know, around building codes and things like that. But there's always a story of someone doing something in their neighborhood, or a neighbor installing a heat pump, or, you know, like there's that's kind of what I would advocate to focus on, is like find the stories of things happening as opposed to falling into the trap of the anxiety created by nothing's happening, because there is a lot happening. Um, it's just gone underground, you know, to use the water metaphor. It's like a creek that's gone underground and it's still moving. There's still stuff happening. So it's like finding those stories. And I think that is an anecdote to the anxiety. Um, and then the third question was challenges I've had in telling climate stories to policymakers and the public. Um, I think I mean, yeah, I think the challenge that can happen is kind of like reach, you know, like you make something and then you're like, is this reaching anyone? Is this making a difference? You know, why did I go to the trouble of making it? So that's happened to me before, where you make something and it doesn't really get the traction that you were hoping. That can happen. Um, but then I come back to, you know, these principles I've been talking about, or this framework, because when you do it from a community engaged perspective, you kind of have the audience already built in. So you're making something that they really need. So then that's how I do my work now. Like I'm not going to make something unless I know it's going to be used. So I'm not just going to like go make a film or a video. It's got to have like a purpose and an audience, even if that audience is small. But it's like it could be small, but they're going to use it in a way to like communicate to their people or to build understanding or whatever. So I think it's like a challenge is getting it seen and having it get traction, but then readjusting your planning and your sort of like scope so that it's really targeted and intentional when you are putting in the energy of making something. Okay. I'm gonna wrap up here soon. If there's any last questions, just I'll open it up one last time at the end, but I did want to just mention a couple storytelling things because we talked a bit about it throughout, but there was just a couple more things I wanted to mention. So climate storytelling, as we've talked about, can serve as a research method and a mode of community building and a mechanism for knowledge mobilization. So it has that three-pronged power to it. And it can transform private experiences into public ones, as I was sharing with my story. And this can help build communities and build trust related to climate. Um, and it can help foster a sense of agency, connection, and empowerment, especially if that story tells the story of you know, a challenge that was overcome, or like the story of a community that's built momentum to get something that they were wanting related to climate. And so I just wanted to end on emphasizing how important it is to tell stories as human beings. You know, it's probably one of our first technologies. And so just thinking about that. And then I did want to share this public narrative framework, which is like a classic storytelling framework that's used in social movements, developed by Marshall Gans, who was like a community organizer. And there's a bunch of different frameworks like this that you'll find online. So I just chose this one, but I really like this one where it's a way of writing your climate story that is also a collective story. So you start the story by telling the story of self. So you and why you're here, why you're talking, why you care. And then you tell the story of us. So how your specific story and specific values are shared values and shared experience. So what's the story of us as like a neighborhood or a university or a family or whatever. And then you end with the story of now. So why is it important that we act now? And then that's your kind of like ask, whatever it is that you're trying to do, and emphasizing the importance of why we need to act now. And then you can see the story of self and the story of us builds community, the story of us and the story of now builds urgency, and the story of self and story of now builds purpose. So that's just a really good thing to kind of chew on if you're interested in thinking about your own climate story, personal story, or just like the story of maybe your research project. It's a good framework to work with. And we'll move to the next slide. I think maybe I'll play this. This is a story from the Sunrise Movement, and I'm just using it as a way to show the example of the public narrative framework because they do it beautifully here in this story. We're not all going to be able to produce something this good, but it is a good aspiration to have to think about how this story is being told, and how it supports a larger movement. So maybe we'll just play this and then we'll wrap up.
My name is Ray Norton, and I'm 18 years old. This is how climate change and pollution has affected me. One of my most distinct memories growing up in Detroit is going south on I-75. Smelling the pollution coming from Marathon and seeing the smoke and the fire on the freeway. I remember trying to hold my breath as long as I could, but eventually you have to breathe in. I've lived in Detroit my whole life. We bounced around a lot when I was a kid. We couldn't always afford to pay rent, and neither could a lot of my friends and family. I know that the planet is on a path towards destruction, and I know that it's caused by the same people who produce the smells and the smoke on the freeway. Poor people, minorities, and young people like me are facing violence and threats in our lives every day from a system that treats us like resources to be extracted.
So this is my old neighborhood. The wall that separates Detroit and Grosse Pointe over there was a big site for dumpers. Like business owners usually would come and you would see them dumping their trash, their tires, or roof shingles. These houses are all built, 50, some of them even 100 years ago across the city, and all of them are built with the methods of, asbestos, lead. In our own house, we had lead paint chips, and whenever these houses get knocked down and burned down, the neighborhood is affected by that. We breathe that air in.
I see these forces of oppression so clearly. I've come to realize, like a lot of young people, that it's our economy. An economy ruled by profit. An economy that needs our environment to be disposable and needs people to be disposable. At the same time, I was seeing videos of young people across the country going to their elected officials and demanding action on the climate and pollution. I was arrested with other activists for sitting in at Nancy Pelosi's office and demanding a Green New Deal. Our generation is sick of a system that leaves us with no future and no hope for a better life. It's not you and me that has to change. It's the system that allows companies, shareholders, and billionaires to destroy our planet. The Sunrise Movement, to me, is about elevating young people to fight on the front lines of building a new, more just, more fair future. I've lived in pollution, in poverty, in climate change my whole life. As long as those things exist, I'll continue to struggle.
Okay, so yeah, very powerful story, social movement story. But just a good example of how a first person narrative can tell the story of systemic issues, right? Or the poly crisis or whatever you want to talk about. That's how powerful a personal narrative can be. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share that example and then we'll move to the next slide. And then this was just want to close on this. This was a project we're just wrapping up right now where we worked with illustration to kind of tell a story where so we were doing this policy report, Rebuilding Through the Aftermath, which was about how we looked at Lahaina, Hawaii, and Linton, BC, both towns burned down to the ground because of a climate change fueled wildfire. And we compared the two and we looked at what are the governance gaps that resulted after fires like that, and how could fires like that facilitate a more like systemic change around policy development and more of a collaborative care approach to how communities like rebuild after a disaster. And we worked with the idea of the octopus. So this idea I wanted to introduce around you working with metaphor, even when you're writing something like a policy paper, which is very dry and boring in a lot of ways. But you can bring in a metaphor like an octopus, which, we used it in a few different ways to talk about how this what the situation was like before, what it was like after, how the octopus, moves and changes and how it like deals with complexity. And in one context, we described an octopus as like a bureaucratic force. In another, we talked about the octopus as like a capitalistic force. And then in the third, we talked about it as like a community care force. And in each one, the octopus is doing different things. But this metaphor allowed us to like tell this, I thought, quite compelling story throughout our policy paper. And so we thought like that might get attention in ways that it might not otherwise get. And it might resonate with people in a different way. And so that's another way that you can kind of work with art and illustration and metaphor in these contexts where that hasn't been introduced before, can work as an advantage because people are curious, right? Surprised as why you would use that and what is this illustration doing in this policy document. So yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to share. So we'll just move to the next slide. And I'll just say thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. That's my info there. Happy to connect with folks who want to connect afterwards. And I don't know if there's any last questions, but I'll open it up for any last questions.